In 1960, there was a great commotion at the Washington Zoo. A rare white Bengal tiger called Mohini had arrived from India. Everyone came to ogle at Mohini's beauty and rarity. At first, they were oblivious to the fact that she spent her hours pacing her 12-foot by 12-foot cage. Eventually, the zoo built a larger enclosure for their star attraction. Mohini was given plenty of space to enjoy a better quality of life. And yet, when she arrived at her new home, Mohini did not rush out to investigate her new habitat. Instead, she simply marked off a 12-foot by 12-foot space, pacing around it until the day of her death, never taking advantage of the opportunities in front of her. Until this past year, I had thought about Mohini's story as a warning against letting the cages of our minds inhibit us from achieving our full potential. However, since coming out of the most recent lockdown, I have found new significance in Mohini's tale. No doubt many rabbis will be giving Rosh Hashanah sermons asking what we have learnt about ourselves during this pandemic. Maybe asking people to question what new opportunities they have enjoyed or how they have reclaimed some of their time. But I have to ask you a harder question. In the Jerusalem Talmud, there is a wonderful teaching by the 3rd century sage, Rabbi Hezekiah. He makes it clear that at the end of our lives, we will have to give an account for every single one of our wrongdoings. But then he adds this beautiful challenge. A person will also have to answer for every good thing which passed before their eyes, but they failed to enjoy. What an amazing idea that we are responsible not only for trying to do what is right, but also for squeezing every single drop of opportunity out of this wonderful life. And that is why on this new year, on this Yom Hadin, this holy day of judgment, I want us to reflect on all the wonderful things that we have lost. I do this not to torment us. I would never do that. Last year, I urged us to be positive and to embrace a Shana Tikva, a year of hope. Certainly that hope arrived in the shape of a vaccine, but alongside the vaccine came those variants, and they have thrown such a terrible question over a COVID-free future. This pandemic might well be with us for some years, although thanks to the miracle of vaccines, probably nowhere near as dangerous. And that is why it would be irresponsible to stand on this bimah and simply urge us to keep on hoping. At some point instead, we must ask ourselves a tough question. What opportunities am I missing? Whether through lockdown, through fear for our lives, or through the understandable concern for the long-term health of our loved ones, have we found ourselves in a 12-foot by 12-foot cage of the mind? And if we have, might we be able to start looking beyond it, at the world around us, at a world that we've missed, a world of opportunities, a world full of all the good things that Rabbi Hezekiah urged us to enjoy? So why are we not enjoying them? What is holding us back? Yes, of course, there are risks, and each of us will assess them differently based on our own very valid circumstances. It is so natural when looking at these risks for them to feel overwhelming. But when we break them down, is there one thing, just one small step that we can take out of our comfort zone? Whether it's having a local meal around the corner, or visiting a gallery at the quietest time of the day, or even going to the synagogue, as some of you have done today for the first time in over 18 months. So that question is, might there be something else that we could safely be enjoying? And if the answer to that question is yes, then what is stopping us? When our ancestors were enslaved and caged up in Egypt, they forgot the feeling of freedom. Eventually, they no longer noticed how limited their lives had become. And it's not a surprise, because the Hebrew name for Egypt, Mitzrayim, says it all. Mitzrayim derives from the Hebrew root tsara, to be caged, confined, to be restricted in a narrow place. A similar word from a similar root is the Yiddish word tsoros, terrible woes, things that tie us down. The book of Jonah very much acknowledges that confinement. Jonah describes his entrapment in the dark depths of the fish's belly and uses that same root again, mitzara li el Adonai. In my confined distress, I called out to God. How well we know Jonah's distress, how resonant those ancient stories feel, especially since we have lived through lockdowns and restrictions. But Jonah and Moses and almost every Jewish leader since then has understood that Mitzrayim was never a place where we could remain and thrive. The Hebrew slaves had to leave Egypt. Jonah had to leave the belly of the fish. And at some point, so must we. And though we may still be walking through that proverbial valley of the shadow of death, we must try our very best not to be afraid. Because fear is a terrible and overpowering emotion. I'm sure that many of us remember it as if it were yesterday. This very week, 20 years ago, 2 aeroplanes flew into the Twin Towers in New York, whilst another hit the Pentagon, and a 4th was so bravely and selflessly crashed by its heroic passengers. Within minutes, around the world, people began retreating into the safety of their homes and the security of their 12-foot by 12-foot cage of the mind. Sadly, this was precisely what the terrorists wanted. 2,977 innocent people brutally murdered, resulting in many millions, if not billions, feeling utterly terrified for their lives. Now, I don't know if you can remember the first time you boarded an aeroplane after 9/11, but I bet that you were a little anxious. I can vividly recall being responsible 1 year later for organizing a synagogue trip in 2002, and even up to the last minute having some students withdrawn by their parents. Of course, it would have done no good to reason with those understandably nervous parents about how the risks of being caught in a terrorist incident were far lower than crossing the road, or to simply share that more people die each day from road traffic accidents than those 2,977 innocent victims. It took some people many months, perhaps years, to get back in the air without fearing for their lives. And that was despite all the new safety measures. Such was the power of the wickedness perpetrated by those terrorists. 9/11 had created an overwhelming fear that it could so easily have been you or me. And when that sensation of personal danger emerges, well, we humans tend to retreat to the safety of those cages of our minds. During this pandemic, the vital message, stay home, save lives, has perhaps inadvertently reinforced that very connection between our cages and our safety. And yet, some cages are dangerous, for rather than saving lives, they can ruin them. Never is this better demonstrated than in the Talmudic tale of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He and his son were forced to flee from the Romans. They walled themselves up in a cage where they remained hidden and safe. There was a carob tree for food, there was water, and each day they would do nothing else but study Torah. The months sailed by, and before they knew it, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son had been holed up in their cave for 12 years. It was their haven and their prison. It was their heaven and their hell. It was their home, but it was also their cage. Eventually, when the danger had sufficiently subsided, after 12 years of never interacting with another soul, the two of them ventured back into the world. So much had changed, and even more importantly, so had they. They had lost the ability to interact with others. And Jewish tradition teaches us that everywhere that they looked, flames leapt forth from their eyes, burning everything in their path. Now, it matters not whether this was a hallucination or a manifestation of their heightened holiness after 12 years of constant Torah study, because a few minutes after leaving their cave, they retreated. Whilst the original danger may have passed, those rabbis had become too acclimatized to their 12 years of captivity. Even though they were free men, it took them a further 12 months before they were ready to once again venture forth from that prison. 12 years, 12 months, 12 foot by 12 foot. We all know and understand their story, for we too have been inside their caves and cages. However, we humans are not made for captivity, even if it may be the very place where we feel safest. Even then, it cannot become our permanent dwelling place. Eventually, we have to return to life. And that is why, on this first day of the new year, we must begin, if we feel safe, to venture beyond our 12-foot by 12-foot comfort zone. Not long into this pandemic, I was deeply worried about how our community would get through this unprecedented experience. I looked for wisdom in our faith, and I looked for wisdom in our 181-year communal history. I was totally taken aback when I read through the minutes of our council and wardens meetings. In the period between 1918 and 1920, I expected to find that this building had been shut for some of the viral surges during the Spanish flu. But to my shock, nothing really changed. Face-to-face meetings went ahead. Services with singing took place. Not a single word of concern was recorded in those minutes. Yes, of course, there were more deaths, many of them tragically young, but in a country which was already heartbroken by the tragedies of the Great War, the Spanish flu didn't seem to cause a tremendous sense of alarm. And to my surprise, the same can be said from the minutes of meetings during the Blitz, when this synagogue somehow kept going. Of course, people were in danger and very much afraid, but somehow, like all our predecessors, they learnt to live with the dangers around them. Little by little, they got on with their lives, making the most of the opportunities in front of them. Now, in these COVID-restricted times, that may all sound quite obvious to someone who is young or healthy or in a lower risk category. But it's a whole different matter when you've been told that you have to shield and that your life is in danger. I know that there are too many of you watching online who have lived through that very real danger and are yearning for an ability to return to life as you knew and loved it. And yet, even to you, I want to say, look beyond those walls, because one day, before too long, life will return. And to those of you who are less at risk, but rightfully anxious, I urge you to ask yourselves if you have become so acclimatized to your new normal that you're now missing out on too many of the good things in life. And if you are, then let today's shofar call do what it has always done. Historically, the blast of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah signaled the release of slaves at the end of the Jubilee. Today, that same ancient sound should make each of us question, what has enslaved and confined me? And that is why, when we hear the great shofar, let us heed that ancient primal sound. And it's great Tekiah Gedolah. And when we hear it, let us feel challenged to break free from the cages of our minds, to safely but resolutely start to seek out all the good things that we have been missing, to finally free our inner Mohini from her 12-foot by 12-foot cage, to open our eyes just a little bit wider, and in so doing, to choose freedom and to choose life. Shana Tova.